February 14th, 1942. Valentine's Day. While most of America exchanged cards and chocolates, a professor hunched over a laboratory bench in the basement of Harvard's Converse Chemistry Laboratory, stirring a powder into gasoline with nothing more than a wooden rod. The mixture turned thick, gelatinous, clinging to the rod like honey to a spoon. Fieser lifted the rod from the beaker and watched the substance drip slowly back down, its consistency perfect, stable, deadly. He had no idea that what he'd just created would incinerate more Japanese cities than the atomic bomb, or that his Valentine's Day gift to the world would become synonymous with horror itself. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. But 3 months earlier, halfway across the Pacific, men were dying because of what he hadn't yet invented. December 19th, 1942. Buna, New Guinea. The air hung heavy with the stench of rotting vegetation and cordite. Corporal James Mitchell crouched behind a fallen palm tree, his M1 flamethrower strapped to his back like a coffin waiting to claim him. 72 pounds of steel, gasoline, and nitrogen that promised to turn Japanese bunkers into crematoriums. It hadn't worked that way. Not even close. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese bunker sat 30 yards ahead, invisible beneath layers of coconut logs, dirt, and camouflage. Machine gun fire ripped through the jungle canopy, shredding leaves and bark. 2 men from Mitchell's platoon already lay motionless in the mud. The bunker had to be taken. Mitchell's lieutenant looked at him, then at the flamethrower, then back at his face. No words were necessary. Mitchell nodded and began crawling forward. His hands shook as they gripped the nozzle. The M1 was supposed to be a miracle weapon, the thing that would end bunker warfare and save American lives. That's what they'd told him during the 3-hour training session back in Australia. 3 hours. To learn how to operate a weapon that made him a walking bomb, that required him to get within 15 yards of men who wanted nothing more than to kill him. He reached the prescribed distance, raised the nozzle, and squeezed the trigger. The spark plug fired, hydrogen ignited. And then, nothing. The gasoline refused to light. Mitchell squeezed again. A weak sputter of unignited fuel dribbled from the nozzle like water from a garden hose. The Japanese inside the bunker heard it, heard that telltale hiss of nitrogen releasing from the tanks. They knew exactly what it meant. The machine gun swung toward him. Mitchell felt the rounds hit his helmet first, a stunning impact that rang through his skull like a church bell. Then his chest, then his legs. He fell backward into the mud, the useless flamethrower still strapped to his body, gasoline pooling around him but refusing to ignite because the ignition system had failed again. Because the weapon was a 90-day wonder, rushed into production by a company that made fire extinguishers and knew nothing about combat engineering. Because America, despite entering the war a year earlier, still didn't have a working flamethrower. 2 days later, another assault, another M1, another failure. The weapon simply fizzed out, and Japanese gunners shot it to pieces. The infantry's confidence in the flamethrower shattered completely. By January 1943, the Army's chief chemical officer in the Pacific wrote that the flamethrower had let the infantry down at such a critical moment that he feared they would never want to use them again. In Washington, a colonel declared that a weapon with such a temperamental nature had no place in modern warfare. But the problem wasn't just the weapon, it was the fuel. Gasoline, it turned out, made a terrible flamethrower fuel. When ignited, it exploded in a massive bloom that consumed itself within seconds, most of the flame evaporating before it reached the target. The M1's range was listed as 15 to 20 yards, but in practice, men had to approach within 10 yards for any effect. 10 yards from machine gun nests, 10 yards from men with nothing to lose. And even then, the flame rolled off targets like water off a duck's back, failing to stick, failing to penetrate, failing to do the one thing it needed to do: kill what was inside. American soldiers weren't the only ones struggling. On the other side of the world, in the frozen forests of Finland and the scorching deserts of North Africa, Every army had discovered the same fundamental limitation. Fire was terrifying, yes, but unthickened gasoline was too volatile, too short-ranged, too unreliable. The weapon that should have been decisive was instead a liability. Back in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Louis Fieser knew none of this. Not yet. He was 42 years old, one of America's most respected organic chemists, the kind of man who'd been nominated for the Nobel Prize and elected to the National Academy of Sciences before most people finished their doctorates. His work on blood-clotting agents and the synthesis of vitamin K had already saved countless lives. He should have been continuing that work, teaching classes, writing papers, living the quiet life of an academic. Instead, in the summer of 1941, he'd received a visit from the military. They needed help with a problem. Actually, they needed help with several problems, and they weren't being particularly specific about what those problems were. National security, they said. Top secret research. Would he be interested? Fieser's wife Mary, who collaborated with him on most of his research, wasn't told anything at first. She only learned about the project weeks later when she met a military officer at the airport who asked how her husband's incendiary project was progressing. By then, Fieser had already stopped teaching. Harvard continued paying his salary, but unofficially, his services belonged entirely to the government. The National Defense Research Committee had given him a contract totaling $359,125. His assignment: develop better ways to burn things. Initially, they wanted him to work on poison gas. Fieser hated the idea. He swallowed his pride and took the assignment anyway, but his heart wasn't in it. Then his focus shifted to incendiaries, substances that burned well and stuck to surfaces. Here, finally, was something that captured his imagination. Not because he wanted to kill people. Fieser would later insist, over and over, that he'd never thought about anti-personnel use. He was thinking about structures, factories, the wooden buildings of Japanese cities. He convinced himself that his work would destroy things, not people. It was a distinction that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He started with basic chemistry. Gasoline burned hot and fast because it was volatile, its molecules eager to release their energy and evaporate into the air. What if you could slow that process? What if you could make gasoline behave less like a liquid and more like a gel, something that would stick to surfaces and burn steadily instead of exploding in a brilliant but brief flash? The concept wasn't new. Others had tried. The British had experimented with rubber additives. The Japanese had used crude thickening agents in their flamethrowers as early as 1937, but none of the solutions were practical for mass production. Rubber was in short supply because of the war in the Pacific. Other thickeners were too complex to manufacture or too unstable in different temperatures. Fieser needed something simpler, something you could make from readily available materials, something that would work in the freezing cold of Europe or the sweltering heat of the Pacific. Something that a soldier could mix in the field with nothing more than a stick and a bucket. He assembled a small team, 6 men who would work with him for the next 4 years in near-total secrecy. They tested hundreds of compounds, looking for the right combination of thickness, stability, and flammability. They burned samples in wooden frames, measuring how the flame spread, how long it lasted, how completely it consumed the target. The thinner the wood, the more efficient the reaction. But efficiency wasn't enough. They needed something that would stick. By early 1942, Fieser had narrowed his focus to aluminum salts, specifically 2 compounds, aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate. When mixed with gasoline at room temperature, these created a gel that was tough, sticky, and absolutely devastating when ignited. On February 14, 1942, he reported his findings to the National Defense Research Committee. The mixture worked. He had his formula. He needed a name for it. Something short, something the military could use in reports and requisition forms. He took the first syllables of the 2 key ingredients, naphthenic and palmitic acids, napalm. It was, as he would later describe it, quite simple. You just took gasoline, sprinkled in some powder, and stirred. First, it turned into a mixture the consistency of applesauce. Then you let it sit a while, and it turned into a thick, tough gel, simple enough that a soldier could prepare it in the field, stable enough that it would work in any climate, sticky enough that it would cling to whatever it touched until it burned itself out. The first tests were small-scale. Fieser placed the yellow sticky substance into wooden frames and watched it burn. Then he needed to see what it could do on a larger scale, in conditions that simulated actual combat. For that, he would need space, witnesses, and permission to set off an explosion on Harvard property. He chose the Harvard College soccer field, a flat open area between the business school and the football stadium. July 4th, 1942. Independence Day. While the rest of America celebrated with fireworks and parades, Fieser prepared to demonstrate a weapon that would redefine modern warfare. Harvard staff gathered as witnesses. The Cambridge Fire Department stood by, just in case. A makeshift pool was dug in the ground, filled with shallow water to contain any mishaps. 45 pounds of napalm sat in the center of the pool, attached to a white phosphorus igniter. Fieser had warned everyone to stay back. Tennis players on nearby courts continued their games, oblivious to what was about to happen. Fieser pressed the button. The white phosphorus detonated first, a brilliant flash of light and heat. Then the napalm ignited. Flaming lumps of gelatin flew through the air, splashing into the water, sticking to the sides of the pool, burning with an intensity that made everyone instinctively step backward. The heat washed over the observers even from a distance. The tennis players stopped mid-serve and yelped in surprise. The Cambridge firefighters watched grimly, understanding immediately what they were seeing. Fieser stood there, observing, taking notes. The flame burned steadily, methodically, consuming the napalm completely. It didn't explode and fade like gasoline. It burned like it had all the time in the world. He calculated later that napalm was 6 times as strong as thermite. It stuck to surfaces and continued burning until nothing remained but ash. The test was a complete success. But success in a controlled environment is one thing. Success in combat is another entirely, and halfway across the Pacific, men were still dying with useless flamethrowers strapped to their backs, still trying to defeat concrete bunkers with weapons that barely functioned. They didn't know that salvation was coming. They didn't know that a chemistry professor had just solved their problem with a mixture so simple it could be stirred with a wooden stick. The question was no longer whether napalm worked. The question was whether it could reach the battlefield in time to matter, and what would happen when it did. The corridors of military bureaucracy are where good ideas often go to die, smothered by red tape, lost in committees, delayed by officers who prefer established methods over untested innovations. Napalm should have suffered that fate. It was new, unproven in combat, developed by a college professor who'd never been to war. The Chemical Warfare Service had every reason to move slowly, to conduct more tests, to wait until they were absolutely certain, but the war wouldn't wait. By the summer of 1942, American forces were fully engaged across 2 theaters. In Europe, the Battle of the Atlantic raged. In the Pacific, Marines had landed on Guadalcanal in August, beginning a brutal island-hopping campaign that would define the war against Japan. And everywhere American troops fought, they encountered defensive positions that conventional weapons couldn't crack. Machine gun nests built into hillsides, bunkers reinforced with logs and steel, caves that swallowed artillery fire and gave nothing back but muzzle flashes. The military needed napalm, desperately. By the middle of 1942, the United States Army began using Fieser's formula in combat. The rollout was remarkably fast for wartime logistics. One moment it existed only in laboratory notebooks and on a soccer field in Cambridge. The next, it was being shipped to bases across the Pacific, accompanied by instructions so simple that almost anyone could follow them. But there was a problem. Actually, there were 2 problems. The first was that American troops didn't trust flamethrowers anymore. The failures at Buna and elsewhere had destroyed their confidence. The second problem was more fundamental. The existing flamethrowers couldn't handle napalm properly. The M1 flamethrower had been designed for gasoline, which required relatively low pressure to spray. Napalm, being thicker, required much higher pressure to project effectively. When the Chemical Warfare Service tried to use napalm in the M1, the results were mixed at best. The pressure regulators failed, the valves leaked. The flame gun couldn't generate enough force to send the gel any meaningful distance. Initial tests showed that the M1 platform was simply incapable of providing ideal range with the new fuel. This should have been devastating news. Napalm worked perfectly in theory, but couldn't be deployed because the hardware couldn't handle it. The military faced a choice: redesign the weapon or abandon the fuel. Either option would take time that soldiers in the field didn't have. The Chemical Warfare Service chose to adapt. Through the second half of 1942 and into 1943, engineers worked to modify the M1 platform to handle napalm's requirements. The resulting weapon, designated the M1A1, incorporated changes to the fuel system, pressure regulators, valves, and flame gun. Everything had to be reinforced to facilitate the higher pressures required to achieve ideal ranges with the thickened fuel. The M1A1 was a significant improvement, where the M1 could reliably fire to about 20 yards with regular gasoline and only 10% of that fuel reaching into a pillbox. The M1A1 could reach 50 yards with napalm, with 50% of the fuel actually entering the target structure. But the weapon was still temperamental. The battery-operated ignition system failed frequently. Operators learned to carry thermite grenades as backup, hurling them onto unignited streams of napalm to create instantaneous ignition. It worked, but it was crude and dangerous. Still, it was better than nothing. By late 1943, the 1st Marine Division received M1A1 flamethrowers just before the New Britain campaign. The legendary Colonel Louis Chesty Puller observed a demonstration of the new weapon. Afterward, he asked the question that summed up every infantryman's skepticism. "Where do you put the bayonet on the damned thing?" It was a fair question. The flamethrower was heavy, 70 pounds when loaded. It was cumbersome, requiring the operator to expose himself to enemy fire. And even with napalm, it still had limitations. The tanks held only 5 gallons of fuel, enough for 7 to 10 seconds of total burn time. Once empty, the operator was carrying dead weight through combat, waiting to be refilled or killed, whichever came first. But when it worked, when the ignition fired and the napalm sprayed out in a tight jet instead of a diffuse cloud, when it splashed into pillbox openings and ignited inside confined spaces where men couldn't escape, the weapon was apocalyptic. Marines called it liquid fire. The Japanese called it something else, words that don't translate easily but convey the same essential meaning. The end of hope. The Japanese defensive strategy had evolved throughout 1943 and early 1944. After watching the Americans take island after island through overwhelming firepower, Japanese commanders realized that beach defenses were futile. The new strategy was defense in depth, fortifications built not to stop invasions but to bleed them dry. Every bunker became a tomb that required American blood to open. Every cave system became a labyrinth where conventional weapons were useless. Tarawa in November 1943 showed what this meant. The island was a fortress of coconut log bunkers, each one requiring direct assault by demolition teams and flamethrowers. The Marines brought M1A1s ashore, and for the first time, the weapons performed acceptably. Not perfectly, the ignition systems still failed often, but acceptably. The flamethrower had officially become a necessary tool of island warfare. By 1944, the Marines had learned hard lessons about how to use the weapon effectively. They formed assault groups, demolition men carrying satchel charges, automatic riflemen with Browning automatic rifles for suppressive fire, and flamethrower operators carrying death on their backs. The tactic became known as corkscrew and blowtorch. The BARs would lay down covering fire, keeping Japanese defenders pinned inside their fortifications. The flamethrower would crawl forward, getting as close as necessary, then spray napalm into openings, air vents, firing ports. The demolition men would follow, sealing cave mouths with explosives or collapsing entire structures. It was brutally effective. It was also brutally dangerous for the men carrying the flamethrowers. The average lifespan of a flamethrower operator in combat was estimated at 4 minutes from the moment they engaged. 4 minutes. That's how long it took for Japanese defenders to identify the threat, concentrate fire on the operator, and cut him down. The bright orange flame was visible from hundreds of yards away. The distinctive hiss of nitrogen releasing from the tanks betrayed the operator's position even before he fired. And once the flame ignited, the black smoke from burning napalm created a signature that drew fire like a magnet. Marine Corps correspondent reports from Iwo Jima later noted that flamethrowers suffered particularly heavy casualties. The Japanese feared and hated their fire. When they saw a flamethrower advancing, they concentrated everything on him. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, all aimed at the man carrying 70 pounds of flammable gel on his back. Some Marines swore that enemy mortar crews didn't fire at units. They fired at individual flamethrower operators. Yet men volunteered for the job. Some were assigned, others stepped forward when asked. Private First Class Tony Tutalo of the 24th Marines stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 126 pounds. The M2 flamethrower alone weighed more than half his body weight. At 19 years old, he trained for months at Camp Maui, learning how to burn things with napalm. "You're carrying a tank of napalm," he later recalled. "But at that time, you don't think it's dangerous. Your mind doesn't think about that." The Chemical Warfare Service had continued refining both the weapon and the fuel through 1943 and into 1944. The experiments were constant, methodical, searching for the perfect combination of range, heat, and adhesion. Marines in the field ran their own tests, mixing gasoline with diesel fuel in different ratios, trying kerosene and motor oil, testing everything they could get their hands on. They discovered that pure diesel was too heavy. The flame travelled only a few feet. Pure gasoline lacked body and dissipated too quickly. But a 1-to-1 ratio of gasoline and diesel, mixed with the napalm powder, gave enough body and heat to send fire 20 to 30 yards with devastating effect. By the summer of 1944, the final version arrived, the M2-2 flamethrower. It was lighter than the M1A1, more reliable, with an improved ignition system that actually worked most of the time. It still used nitrogen as propellant, still carried the same basic fuel load, still had the same terrifying mission profile. But it worked. Finally, after years of failure and modification, America had a flamethrower that could compete with anything the Germans or Japanese fielded, and it arrived just in time for the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Peleliu, September 1944. The island was supposed to fall in 3 days. It took 2 months. The Japanese had carved the entire island into a defensive position, with caves and tunnels connecting hundreds of fortified positions. Conventional weapons made almost no progress. The flamethrowers made the difference, crawling into positions where tanks couldn't follow, burning out defenders who wouldn't surrender. Iwo Jima, February 1945. The ultimate test. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months preparing the island's defenses. He'd studied American tactics carefully and designed a system specifically to defeat them. 11 miles of reinforced concrete tunnels connected over 1,500 positions. Every cave was mutually supporting, every pillbox covered by another pillbox. The volcanic rock absorbed artillery fire and naval bombardment with minimal damage. American intelligence estimated the island would fall in 5 days. It took 36, and it cost nearly 7,000 American lives. The flamethrowers landed on D-Day, all 8 of the Navy's modified Sherman tanks equipped with the latest flame projectors. They sat unused on the beach that first day, waiting for orders, waiting for the moment when they'd be needed. That moment came on D+2. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The reports from the front lines were desperate. Marines were pinned down, unable to advance against pillboxes that artillery couldn't touch. Tank-mounted cannons were useless against positions buried under feet of rock and concrete. Infantry assaults were suicide. The commanders called for the flame tanks. The M4 Sherman with the CWS-POAH-1 flamethrower system was a monster. 300 gallons of napalm, fed through a projector that could reach 120 meters. The Japanese called them something that roughly translated to dragon tanks. Marines called them Zippos. Whatever the name, the effect was the same. The tanks would approach a fortified position, their armor shrugging off machine gun fire. Then they'd unleash hell itself, a stream of napalm that reached into openings that conventional weapons couldn't touch, that filled confined spaces with fire hot enough to consume, everything organic, that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. On Iwo Jima, 10,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel were used daily, split between the man-portable M2-2 flamethrowers and the Sherman flame tanks. Over the 36-day campaign, 360,000 gallons total. The numbers were staggering, but they represented something more than logistics. They represented the only way American forces could defeat an enemy that had turned an entire island into a fortress. Over 30% of all Japanese killed on Iwo Jima died not from bullets or explosions, but from being incinerated alive by napalm. That's not propaganda or exaggeration. That's the official estimate from military historians who studied casualty reports. 30%. Thousands of men who didn't die from conventional weapons but from a chemical formula developed by a chemistry professor in a Cambridge basement. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams carried an M2-2 flamethrower into combat on February 23, 1945. The same day the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi. His unit had been trying to cross the airfield for days, but Japanese pillboxes had stopped every advance. The casualties were mounting. His commander called a meeting in a shell crater to stay out of the line of fire. They asked Williams, as the only flamethrower and demolition expert left, would he do something about the pillboxes that had them stalled. Williams selected 4 Marines to provide covering fire. 2 of them wouldn't survive. For the next 4 hours, Williams crawled from position to position with 70 pounds of napalm on his back, systematically destroying Japanese fortifications. At one point, he climbed atop a pillbox and fired through the air vent, killing everyone inside. The Marine Corps later awarded him the Medal of Honor. Of the 27 Medals of Honor awarded at Iwo Jima, 12 were for efforts in eliminating enemy positions. Only 6 of those recipients survived to receive the medal. But the weapon's effectiveness came with a cost that couldn't be measured in casualties or strategic objectives. Marines who operated flamethrowers later spoke about the psychological weight of the weapon. Eugene Sledge, who would write one of the definitive memoirs of the Pacific War, described his training with the M2-2. I shouldered the heavy tanks, held the nozzle in both hands, pointed at the stump about 25 yards away, and pressed the trigger. With a whoosh, a stream of flame squirted out, and the nozzle bucked. The napalm hit the stump with a loud splattering noise. I felt the heat on my face. A cloud of black smoke rushed upward. The thought of turning loose hellfire from a hose nozzle as easily as I'd water a lawn back home sobered me. Major General Clifton Cates, who commanded the 4th Marine Division on Iwo Jima and later became Commandant of the Marine Corps, said he couldn't think of a more inhumane weapon, yet he also said it was necessary. That's the terrible arithmetic of war. The weapon was inhumane. It was also indispensable. Back in Cambridge, Louis Fieser continued his work through the war's end. He never visited the Pacific, never saw what his invention did in practice. He conducted his tests, refined his formulas, and tried to focus on the technical challenges rather than the human cost. By the end of the war, the United States was producing 75 million pounds of napalm annually. Dow Chemical had taken over mass production. Fieser's formula had become standardized, patented in 1952, and distributed globally. After the war ended, Fieser returned to teaching at Harvard. He went back to his research on organic chemistry, on steroids and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, on work that wouldn't haunt him, in quiet moments. He never worked for the government again, but the government continued using napalm. In Greece, where it helped defeat communist forces in 1948. In Korea, where United Nations forces eventually dropped twice as much on the peninsula as fell on Japan during World War II, and later in Vietnam. For 25 years, Fieser said nothing publicly about the weapon he'd created. He lived quietly, taught classes, wrote textbooks, built a distinguished career. Napalm became someone else's problem, someone else's legacy. Then, one morning in June 1972, he opened the Boston Herald and read about a napalm accident in Vietnam, 20 civilians and soldiers killed or maimed. He learned that his invention, the one he'd designed to burn structures, was being used as an anti-personnel weapon, being dropped from aircraft onto villages, being fired at human beings who had no way to defend against it. He wrote a letter to President Richard Nixon. "It seems to me desirable," he wrote, "to try to promote an international agreement to outlaw further use of napalm or napalm-type munitions." The response came from Nixon's science advisor, who acknowledged that the uses of napalm were difficult to predict or control, and assured Fieser that his suggestion would be given very careful attention. Fieser called it a brush-off. He was right. The United States continued using napalm in Vietnam. By the time the war ended in 1975, 388,000 tons had been dropped, 10 times the amount used in Korea, nearly 20 times the amount used in World War II. The photograph of 9-year-old Kim Phuc, burned naked as she ran from a napalm attack, became an icon of anti-war protest. Napalm, which had been born a hero in 1942, now lived as a pariah. Fieser never apologized for inventing it. When asked, he maintained that he had no right to judge the morality of napalm just because he'd invented it. He compared himself to a gun manufacturer who couldn't be held responsible if someone used his rifle to shoot the president. "I discovered that a gelled fuel burns more efficiently than a free fuel," he said. "I don't think I have to be ashamed of having made that discovery, but in private moments he must have thought about it. About the laboratory in Cambridge, where he'd stirred powder into gasoline with a wooden stick. About the soccer field test on July 4th, when he demonstrated that the gel would burn steadily and stick to surfaces. About the technical problems he'd solved, the elegant chemistry that had made the impossible possible. About the distinction he'd tried to maintain between burning things and burning people, a distinction that collapsed completely the moment his invention reached the battlefield. When Fieser died on July 25, 1977, at 78 years old, only a few local papers mentioned his passing. One headline read, "Inventor of tank device dies at 53. It was factually wrong, he was 78, not 53, but the error seemed appropriate somehow. The world had already forgotten who he was. They remembered napalm, but not its creator. They remembered the burning children in Vietnam, but not the chemistry professor who'd thought he was developing something to burn factories." The story of napalm isn't just about chemistry or military innovation. It's about the distance between intention and consequence, about how something created for one purpose can become something entirely different when released into the world. Fieser wanted to save American lives by giving them a weapon that could defeat fortifications without requiring direct assault. He succeeded. The flamethrowers, equipped with napalm, did save American lives. They turned bunkers that would have cost hundreds of casualties into targets that could be neutralized by one man with 70 pounds on his back. But those same flamethrowers also incinerated thousands of Japanese soldiers who had no chance to escape confined spaces filled with burning gel. The same weapon that liberated Iwo Jima became the weapon that burned Vietnamese villages. The same formula that won awards in 1942 became a symbol of American brutality by 1972. History doesn't often provide clean answers about whether innovations are good or evil. Most weapons exist in a grey space where their value depends entirely on who uses them and how. Napalm could clear fortifications that conventional weapons couldn't touch, saving lives by making impossible objectives achievable. Napalm could also burn people alive in ways that violated every conception of humane warfare. Both statements are true. Both existed simultaneously. The real lesson isn't about napalm itself. It's about what happens when scientists create without fully considering consequences, when military necessity overrides ethical reflection, when the momentum of war carries innovations forward faster than wisdom can catch up. Fieser spent one day, Valentine's Day 1942, creating the formula. He spent the next 35 years living with what that formula became. In the years after World War II, flamethrowers slowly disappeared from American arsenals. The military determined that they were of questionable effectiveness in modern combat. The last American infantry flamethrower, the M9-7, was retired in 1978. The Department of Defense unilaterally stopped using them, not because of international law. Napalm is still legal under international law when used against combatants, but because tactics had evolved. Precision weapons, air support, and explosive charges could accomplish the same objectives without requiring soldiers to carry 70 pounds of burning gel into close combat. But napalm itself never became obsolete. Modified versions appeared in conflicts around the world. Cuba, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Argentina, El Salvador, and many others used variations of Fieser's formula. During the Gulf War, Iraqi tanks in Kuwait's oil fields encountered napalm. During the invasion of Iraq in 2003, American forces used Mark 77 firebombs, essentially upgraded napalm, against dug-in positions near Baghdad. The weapon Fieser created has outlived its creator by decades. It continues to exist in military arsenals, modified and improved, but fundamentally the same gel that he stirred in a Cambridge basement 83 years ago. Simple enough that anyone can make it, devastating enough that no one forgets it. When we look back at the development of napalm, we're forced to confront uncomfortable questions about innovation and responsibility. Should Fieser have refused the assignment? Should he have stopped when he realized what his creation could do? Should he have spoken out earlier than 1972? These questions have no easy answers because they assume a level of foresight that no one possesses in the moment. Fieser believed he was solving a technical problem, giving American soldiers a tool to defeat fortifications. He succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. The men who used napalm in combat, from Tarawa to Iwo Jima to Vietnam, they faced different questions. Is it better to burn enemy soldiers out of bunkers, or to assault those bunkers directly, losing more of your own men? Is using napalm against fortified positions moral if it ends battles faster and saves lives on both sides? What happens when the weapon designed for military targets gets used against civilians? The flamethrower operators knew the weapon's horror intimately. They saw what napalm did to human beings, smelled the smoke, heard the screams. Many carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives, unable to talk about it, unable to forget it. They had volunteered or been ordered to carry the weapon. They had done their duty. But duty doesn't erase memory, and memory doesn't provide absolution. Today, if you visit the battlefields where napalm was first used, most traces have disappeared. Guadalcanal is green again. Peleliu's Bloody Nose Ridge is quiet. Iwo Jima, returned to Japan in 1968, allows limited access for remembrance ceremonies. The bunkers still exist, empty now, silent. The volcanic rock still bears scars from flamethrowers and explosives. But nature has reclaimed most of the battlefield, covering the evidence of what happened there. At Harvard, there's no memorial to Louis Fieser's work on napalm. The Converse chemistry laboratory where he developed the formula still stands, though it's been renovated multiple times since 1942. The soccer field where he conducted the first large-scale test is still there, hosting games and practices, with no marker indicating what happened on July 4, 1942. The university has never officially acknowledged Fieser's wartime work, neither celebrating it nor apologizing for it. It exists in the historical record, documented in papers and reports, but not commemorated. Perhaps that's appropriate. Napalm isn't something to celebrate, but it's also not something that can be ignored or forgotten. It's part of the story of how World War II was won and how modern warfare evolved. It's a reminder that scientific innovation, no matter how elegant or effective, carries consequences that extend far beyond the laboratory. The flamethrowers that Napalm transformed from failure to success did save lives, did help win battles, did enable Allied forces to defeat fortified positions that conventional weapons couldn't touch. They also created suffering on a scale that challenges comprehension. Both things are true. Both must be remembered. Louis Fieser spent one day creating napalm and the rest of his life trying to reconcile that creation with its consequences. He maintained that he wasn't responsible for how others used his invention, but he also tried, too late, to have it banned. He lived long enough to see his Valentine's Day gift to the military become a symbol of everything cruel about modern war. Whether that was fair or not is a question each person must answer for themselves. What's undeniable is this: one chemist, working in a basement laboratory with readily available materials, changed warfare forever. He turned an unreliable weapon into an indispensable tool. He solved a problem that had plagued military forces for decades, and in doing so, he created something that would haunt battlefields and consciences for generations. The story of napalm is a story about innovation and horror, about necessity and excess, about how the same invention can save lives and destroy them. It's about a chemistry professor who thought he was building something to burn factories and soldiers who discovered it could burn anything. It's about the distance between what we intend and what we create, between laboratory success and battlefield reality. Most of all, it's a reminder that every innovation carries weight beyond its immediate purpose. That every solution creates new problems. That every weapon, no matter how justified in the moment, becomes something we have to live with forever. Whether that change was worth the cost is a calculation that doesn't resolve cleanly, then or now. The bunkers on Pacific Islands are empty now. The flamethrowers are in museums. The men who carried them into combat are mostly gone, taking their memories with them. But napalm endures, in military stockpiles, in historical record, in the collective memory of what humans can create and what that creation can do. That's the legacy of one chemist's forbidden formula. Not just a weapon, but a question about responsibility, innovation, and the consequences of our solutions. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.